Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Trump built up Mideast forces to protect Israel. So on Tuesday, the White House published a letter President Trump sent to Congress on March 25th that said he was ordering a buildup of U.S. military forces in the Middle East to protect Israel as well as U.S. assets in the region. In the letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate President pro tempore Chuck Grassley, Trump said that he was writing it to inform them of the situation in Yemen and the broader Middle East region. This was about 10 days after he launched the bombing campaign in Yemen. He said in the letter, quote, "First, I directed the Department of Defense to move additional forces equipped for combat into the Middle East to enhance the defensive capabilities available to the United States forces and facilitate necessary military actions," end quote. He said that the military buildup included, quote, "capabilities for air and missile defense of Israel and of locations hosting United States forces, as well as fighter support, reconnaissance aircraft to enable strikes on Houthi targets," end quote. So he explicitly says there that one purpose of this military buildup is to protect Israel, and it's been clear that this bombing campaign is being done on the behalf of Israel. They started it in response to the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, saying that they were going to restart their blockade on Israeli shipping. And they did that in response to Israel violating the ceasefire in Gaza and imposing a total blockade on the Gaza Strip. And the U.S. started bombing them just after they made that announcement. They actually didn't restart any attacks before the U.S. started bombing them. So we've seen, some of the we've seen reports about some of these assets. We've seen a lot of reports about the overall U.S. military buildup in the Middle East, and there was Israeli media reports that said the U.S. had sent a second terminal high altitude area defense battery, that's the THAAD missile defense system, to Israel, along with Patriot air defense batteries. The U.S. also sent an additional aircraft carrier to the Middle East, B-52 bombers to Diego Garcia, and other air assets in the region, and they've been using 2 aircraft carriers to bomb Yemen, and they've also been using the B-2 bombers from Diego Garcia. I said B-52 bombers. I have to correct that. It's actually B-2 bombers. Trump also said in the letter that at his direction, U.S. Central Command had, quote, "commenced large-scale strikes in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen to eliminate the capabilities the Houthis use for the attacks on United States forces and commercial ships in the Red Sea and surrounding waters," end quote. So the U.S. launched the bombing campaign in Yemen on March 15th, and over a month later, the Houthis remain undeterred and they continue to launch attacks. So while U.S. officials, they frame this as a response to attacks on U.S. ships, but the Houthis were not attacking U.S. ships when this bombing campaign restarted. They stopped their attacks on U.S. ships. They stopped their attacks on Israel when the Gaza ceasefire went into effect on January 19th, and they've been clear that that's the only thing that's going to get them to back down is a ceasefire in Gaza. They have offered a ceasefire with the U.S. A senior member of Ansar Allah's political bureau said that they would stop attacks on U.S. warships if the U.S. stopped bombing Yemen, but he said that they would continue the blockade on Israeli shipping and attacks on Israel. And of course, we've seen Pete Hegseth and even Trump himself say all the Houthis have to do is stop attacking U.S. ships. Actually, what Hegseth said is all they have to do is declare that they'll stop attacking U.S. ships. But they're just ignoring this offer from the Houthis because this bombing campaign is being done for Israel. And they're not going to stop unless the Houthis stop attacking Israel. So, again, that's been very clear. We've also seen reports from Israeli media that the U.S. has told Israel not to respond to the Houthi missile attacks on Israel, saying that the U.S. military will take care of it. And this is just more evidence of that all this is being done to ensure that Israel can continue this genocidal slaughter that we see in Gaza every single day. All right, so the next one here. Houthis shoot down yet another U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone. So Yemeni air defenses have shot down yet another U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone, and this was announced by the Houthis' military spokesman, Yahya Saree. He said, quote, "Our air defense shot down a hostile American MQ-9 Reaper drone while it was carrying out hostile missions in the airspace of the Hajj province," end quote. According to Saree, Yemeni forces have shot down 7 U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drones this month. 7 in the month of April, and 22 since October 2023. And each MQ-9 is worth about $30 million. So that means the U.S. has lost $660 million worth of drones over Yemen in about a year and a half. So the U.S. has not confirmed each time a drone was shot down, but I've seen reports from Jennifer Griffin. She's a Fox News reporter. Occasionally she will confirm, with her sources, and she has sources in the Pentagon, that the U.S. lost a drone. And I saw the last time she did it was on April 18th. And at that time, this is only a few days ago, the Houthis said that they shot down 20 drones since October 2023. And Griffin reported that at least 16 U.S. drones were shot down in that time. But then she cited a source who said that the real number could be as high as 20. So that means it's likely that this number from the Houthis is probably accurate. And $660 million. Griffin said, quote, this is again from her report from a few days ago, "The U.S. military has carried out 35 straight days of bombing, and yet the Houthis continue to fire missiles to shoot these expensive U.S. assets down and continue to fire ballistic missiles at Israel," end quote. So Saree also claimed attacks on the U.S. aircraft carriers off Yemen, the USS Harry Truman and the USS Carl Vinson. U.S. airstrikes were reported in several areas of Yemen on Tuesday, including the northern Sadr province and the Red Sea province of Hodeidah. And then over the weekend, 12 civilians were reported killed by U.S. airstrikes on the Yemeni capital, which hit several targets, including a crowded market. And of course, there was that horrific bombing this past Friday in the fuel port that killed 80 people. As I understand it, civilian workers and paramedics who showed up initially and then were bombed. And that also has will have devastating consequences for Yemeni civilians who are dealing with food shortages and everything. And then I kind of mentioned some of the other stuff in the previous article, but Saree said, I think it's just important to stress, to drive this point home, that their position is that they'll stop if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. That's the only way that they're going to stop. Saree said, quote, "The Yemeni armed forces will not cease supporting and backing the oppressed Palestinian people until the aggression against Gaza stops and the siege is lifted," end quote. All right, the next one here. Trump says that he and Netanyahu are on the same side of every issue. So President Trump said on Tuesday that he spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and that he and the Israeli leader were on the same side of every issue. Trump said in a post on Truth Social that they discussed numerous subjects, including trade, Iran, etc. The call comes after a report said Trump declined to back an Israeli plan to attack Iran, which would have required significant U.S. support, and chose to pursue diplomacy instead. Another report said that Israel was considering a limited attack on Iran without U.S. support, but a final decision hadn't been made. Trump has been threatening to bomb Iran if a deal is not reached on its nuclear program, even though the U.S. intelligence threat assessment said there's no evidence Iran is trying to make a nuclear weapon. According to Axios, Trump and Netanyahu also discussed Gaza and the potential for a ceasefire and hostage deal, although there's no sign that Israel is interested in a diplomatic solution, as it's refusing Hamas's offer for all Israeli captives to be released in exchange for a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. The Trump administration has strongly backed Israel's decision to break the ceasefire agreement signed in January, which would have resulted in the release of all Israeli hostages if implemented. Israel fully restarted its genocidal war on March 18th and has imposed a total blockade on humanitarian aid and all other goods entering Gaza since March 2nd. And Trump has signed off on at least $12 billion in arms deals since returning to office in January. And over the weekend, Israeli media reported that the U.S. delivered 9 plane loads of bunker-busting bombs to Israel to prepare for a potential attack on Iran. But of course, these could also be used on Gaza. So if Trump is aligned with Netanyahu on every issue, that means that the slaughter in Gaza as well, which is very clear because the U.S. is supporting it. So the next one here, Gaza faces worst humanitarian situation yet. So the UN's Humanitarian Office warned on Tuesday that Gaza is facing its worst humanitarian situation yet, as a total Israeli blockade on humanitarian aid and all other goods has been imposed for more than 50 days. So this is Jens Lark, a spokesperson for the UN Humanitarian Office, said, quote, "Right now is probably the worst humanitarian situation we have seen throughout the war in Gaza," end quote. Also on Tuesday, the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency, UNRWA, said Gaza had become a land of desperation and warned of spreading hunger. This is Philip Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, quote, "Hunger is spreading and deepening, deliberate and man-made. 2 million people, a majority of women and children, are undergoing collective punishment," end quote. Lazzarini said that aid trucks, including 3,000 from UNRWA, are ready to enter Gaza but are being blocked by Israel. He said, quote, "The siege must be lifted, supplies must flow in, the hostages must be released, the ceasefire must resume," end quote. And the U.S., of course, is strongly backing this collective punishment of Palestinian civilians, with Mike Huckabee the other day releasing a statement shifting all the blame to Hamas. And that's the Trump administration's line. Oh, Israel executed 15 rescue workers, ambulance workers. That's Hamas's fault. Oh, Israel's slaughtering all these children. It's all Hamas's fault. I think the line from the State Department is that I forget exactly how she put it, Tammy Bruce. She said something like every scenario, every aspect of this is all Hamas's fault. So Israel just has no responsibility for any of this. So just a really horrific situation inside Gaza. All right, the next one here, Israeli attacks kill 32 Palestinians in Gaza. So Israeli attacks on Gaza killed 32 Palestinians on Tuesday. Medical sources told Al Jazeera as Israeli strikes continue to pound targets across the Strip. According to the Associated Press, one Israeli airstrike hit a home in the southern city of Khan Yunis early in the morning, killing at least 9 Palestinians, including 4 women and 4 children. The victims included a 2-year-old girl and her parents. Awad Daliz, the 2-year-old girl's grandfather, told AP, quote, "They were asleep, sleeping in God's peace. They had nothing to do with anything. What is the fault of this innocent child?" End quote. AP also reported that Israeli strikes in Jabalia, northern Gaza, killed 3 children and their parents, and an Israeli attack in Nusret, central Gaza, killed a man and 2 children. The Israeli military also destroyed bulldozers and other heavy machinery being used to clear rubble, claiming that Hamas used them to plant explosives. And these are bulldozers, this is some of the equipment that got in during the ceasefire. Now Israel's bombing it. Israeli strikes on Gaza intensified on Tuesday, according to reports on the ground. Tarek Abu Azum, a reporter for Al Jazeera, said, quote, "What we are seeing is truly extraordinary in terms of very huge momentum of airstrikes and artillery bombardments that have been seen over the course of the past 24 hours. It has been quite obvious that these attacks are focused on eradicating entire families. We're talking about 4 generations being wiped out, and also a more systematic escalation has been taking place on targeting heavy machinery that has been allowed to enter Gaza during the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal," end quote. So just day in and day out, airstrikes, Israel continues to bomb Gaza. Just constantly. All right, so the next one here, Israel continues evacuation orders in Gaza, but no safe zones. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So over the past month, the Israeli Defense Forces have forced many Gazans to flee their homes or shelters. However, Israel is not creating new humanitarian zones for the displaced Palestinians to shelter. According to Haaretz, after Israel broke the ceasefire with Hamas on March 18th and resumed major military operations in Gaza, it has not designated any new safe zones in the Strip. Other areas previously classified as humanitarian zones have been bombed by the IDF nearly 24 times over the past month. Haaretz noted that Israel issued a map of Gaza that eliminated the humanitarian zones on January 15th before the ceasefire and hostage agreement with Hamas came into effect. After the ceasefire took hold, many Gazans sheltering in tents at designated safe zones left to go back to their homes. After Israel resumed operations, many returned to former humanitarian zones. And that is where Israel told them to go. I mean, when they evacuated, they ordered the evacuation of Rafah. They said, go to Al-Mawasi, but they've been bombing it. We've seen it. It seems like almost every day I read about Israel bombing the Al-Mawasi tent camp, which is on the coast, which was before designated as one of these so-called safe zones. Although, as we saw, Israel still bombed them even when they were designated as safe zones. I think probably not as much as they are bombing them now. All right, so the next one here, the Israeli army faked Gaza tunnel photo to justify military presence. This article is from the Palestine Chronicle. So former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has acknowledged that a widely circulated photo released by the Israeli military allegedly showing a large tunnel in the Philadelphia corridor near the Gaza-Egypt border was misleading. According to the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation, Gallant stated that the supposed tunnel never existed. What was actually discovered was a shallow trench only about a meter deep. He said the photo was used to support claims about the existence of tunnels along the corridor to exaggerate the strategic significance of the Philadelphia road and ultimately to stall progress on a prisoner exchange deal. The image in question was first circulated last August by Israeli media, which described it as proof of a massive multi-level tunnel allegedly built by Palestinian resistance groups. So this was one of the ways that Netanyahu sabotaged the peace talks, the ceasefire talks at the time, was by refusing to give up the Philadelphia corridor, saying that they would stay, and then they put out this photo of like a whole big hole, claiming it was a tunnel, but it turns out it was a lie. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to relocate troops to new bases in Syria. So the U.S. plans to establish 2 new military bases in Kurdish-controlled Syria where it will relocate troops as part of a drawdown of its forces in the country. This was reported by Rudao on Monday, which is a Kurdish outlet. Bassam Ishaq, a U.S.-based member of the political wing of the U.S.-backed SDF, which is the force that the U.S. backs in northeast Syria, said the U.S. would establish 1 new base near the Tishreen Dam in northern Syria and another in the southeastern Deir ez-Zor province near the Iraqi border. The Tishreen Dam has been the site of heavy fighting between the SDF and the Turkish-backed SNA. Under an integration deal, the SDF is handing over the dam to the Syrian government, which is led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an offshoot of al-Qaeda. So Ishaq said that the U.S. plans to leave 400 troops in Kurdish-controlled areas of Syria. The U.S. also has bases. Not all the U.S. bases are in the Kurdish-controlled areas. In southern Syria, they have the Al-Tanf garrison. This was controlled by one of these other U.S.-backed militias. And from that base, the U.S. helped coordinate their proxy forces taking part in the offensive, the HTS offensive that ousted Assad. They helped actually coordinate between the militia that they backed down there and HTS, even though it's designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization. The Pentagon announced last week that it would be pulling more than 1,000 troops out of Syria as part of a consolidation of its forces in the country. So the spokesman for the Pentagon, Sean Parnell, said in a statement, quote, "This deliberate and conditions-based process will bring the U.S. footprint in Syria down to less than 1,000 U.S. forces in the coming months," end quote. So for years, the Pentagon claimed that the U.S. only had 900 troops in Syria, but turns out the real number was 2,000. They revealed that at the end of the Biden administration, that they were just lying all along. And Parnell's announcement came after media reports said that the U.S. had informed Israel that it was planning to reduce its military footprint in Syria. The report said Israel is opposed to any U.S. withdrawal or drawdown from the country over concerns that it would lead to an expanded Turkish presence. All right, so the next one here, Syria detains top Palestinian Islamic Jihad leaders after U.S. demands. This one's from Jason Ditz. So Syria's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS government has been unclear about what their position will be on the Palestinians. That's an important issue because there is a large Palestinian population within Syria, and it's also important because the U.S. has recently issued demands for Syria to ban all Palestinian groups from operating or fundraising in the country. And that was, Jason wrote that up over the weekend. So HTS hasn't made any public statements, but they did recently meet with Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PA and Fatah. And apparently Israel was trying to prevent that meeting. So there is some engagement with the Palestinian Authority. But now the HTS just arrested 2 top Palestinian Islamic Jihad members. And they were identified as the head of the PIJ in Syria and the group's organizing committee for the Syrian leader. No official Syrian statement about the arrest has been made, and some media are suggesting that there hasn't been an official charge yet. But again, it's interesting. PIJ has long had a substantial presence in Syria and was often aligned with the Assad-era government, even though they are a Sunni Islamist faction, which ideologically would seem to have more in common with HTS and the other, rebels that eventually took power in Syria. But apparently they stayed closer. Hamas was on the opposition, the rebel side, the HTS side, until they normalized relations with Assad a few years ago, I think, before he was thrown out. But apparently the PIJ stayed close with his government. So that could be one reason why, because of how they were with the Assad government. But also, again, it comes right after these reports that the U.S. is demanding, as part of these conditions for potential sanctions relief, that they don't allow the Palestinian groups to operate on their territory. And then a couple days later, you see that they arrest these Palestinian Islamic Jihad guys. All right, so the next one here. Trump enacts censorship of scientists for Israel. So this article is from Lee Fang at his Substack. And so not only is Trump waging war for Israel, he's also cracking down on free speech in the United States on behalf of Israel. So research institutes and universities may engage in boycotts or divestment to pressure any country or government entity in the world. Recent institutional boycotts include measures to protest corporations that do business in North Carolina and China. That right no longer exists when it comes to protests of Israel. Researchers and university employees who engage in certain non-violent protests or political expression over human rights conditions in Israel may risk civil and criminal penalties, according to a new policy unveiled by the National Institute of Health yesterday. The agency, the largest public funder of biomedical research in the world, touches virtually every corner of the scientific community. The blanket boycott suppression is a radical expansion of so-called anti-BDS rules that restrict Americans from boycotting or simply advocating divestment from Israel-related businesses. The new NIH policy, which mirrors anti-BDS laws applied to contractors in 38 states, now silences hundreds of thousands of researchers. It applies to all domestic recipients of new renewal, supplement, or continuation awards issued starting April 21st. The Trump administration policy reflects a dramatic escalation in speech policing regarding Israel. Since March 8th, immigration agents have arrested and threatened to deport a number of foreign students who have engaged in protest or criticism of Israel's government. Rumeysa Ozturk, a 30-year-old PhD student at Tufts University caught in the recent sweep, was arrested by ICE agents last month, and she now resides in an ICE prison cell in Louisiana. And her arrest is the most egregious that we know about, at least. And this is because she was arrested for writing an op-ed, an opinion column that was published by her school newspaper that called for the school to divest from Israeli companies and recognize the genocide in Gaza. And for that, the PhD student was thrown into a cage. So this NIH thing, I mean, this is very sweeping. This is something I feel like I read about, but then the way Fang put it, the way he, the NIH funding, for medical research, I mean, it's huge. And so, putting these anti-BDS laws and applying it to that, it is just completely outrageous. And man, people really need to speak up about this. Hopefully there's some kind of protests in the, scientific world or medical world. All right, so the next one here, Mahmoud Khalil misses son's birth after ICE denies his request. So this article is from NPR, which is an outlet that I rarely run articles from, but I didn't see a problem with this one. This is, again, just really outrageous what's happening here to this family. So immigration authorities denied an urgent request by Mahmoud Khalil to be temporarily released from detention under monitoring so he could attend the birth of his first child. His wife, Noor Abdallah, delivered their son on Monday in New York. Khalil, who's being held at a remote Louisiana detention center, instead experienced part of the birth through a phone call. Khalil's legal team wrote to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement official overseeing his detention on Sunday and informed her that his wife had gone into labor in New York that morning, emails obtained by NPR show. They asked her to grant Khalil a 2-week conditional release so he could be present for the birth. The lawyers wrote, quote, Mr. Khalil would be open to any combination of conditions that would allow furloughs from ICE's perspective, including a GPS ankle monitor and or scheduled check-ins, end quote. A half hour later, Melissa Harper, the director of ICE's New Orleans field office, denied her request. So, ripping apart a family. And this is an American woman who gave birth, who's married to Khalil, who is a green card holder, permanent citizen, and the U.S. Government is ripping this family apart on behalf of the state of Israel. And the only so-called evidence against Khalil is his political views, is his views on Israel and the occupation and the what's happening in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Israel kills Jamaa Al-Islamiya commander in Lebanon. So this is another one from Jason. So Israel continues with its deadly airstrikes against Lebanon on Tuesday, killing a Jamaa Al-Islamiya commander south of the capital city of Beirut. And this group, as I understand it, as Jason explains, they're aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. I think their roots are in Egypt. But Israel's claiming that they've been involved in some attacks. They do have one single seat in Lebanon's parliament, so they're a relatively small political faction within Lebanon. So that Israel claimed that this guy they killed was involved in planning and promoting hostile activities against Israel along the border. So the Israeli strikes on Lebanon, almost daily, not every day, but almost daily Israeli strikes on Lebanon continue despite that ceasefire deal that was signed and supposed to go into effect in November. All right, so the last story here, a report claims that Putin is willing to halt Ukraine invasion. So there was a report from the Financial Times on Wednesday that said Russian President Vladimir Putin was willing to halt his invasion of Ukraine across the current front lines to reach a peace deal with President Trump. If true, the position would mark a significant concession from Russia, which has maintained that any peace deal must include the recognition of the 4 Ukrainian oblasts that it has annexed as part of Russia, including territory that's not under Russia's control. So these 4 oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, and Russia, does not control all of the territory in a single one of these oblasts. In Luhansk, they control virtually all of it, but not quite. And in Donetsk, they control, just about all of it as well. But so this report said that Putin made the offer during recent talks with President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, when they spoke and met in St. Petersburg earlier this month. After the meeting, Witkoff said that he believed the peace deal was possible. The Washington Post reported on Tuesday that the U.S. has made a proposal to Ukraine and its European allies on potential ceasefire deal that would involve freezing the battle lines and the U.S. recognizing Crimea as part of Russia. And of course, Russia has controlled Crimea since 2014. So the Kremlin responded to this report. I think I skipped over that. Yeah. So Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, was asked about this Financial Times report, and he warned that there was fake reports being published, but he didn't explicitly deny it. He said, quote, "There are a lot of fakes being published right now, including by respected publications, so you should only listen to the original sources," end quote. So on the face of it, it might sound like a denial, but also the Financial Times got a quote from him for their report where he basically said, oh, negotiations are happening. It's tough work. You can't, kind of this typical line he's been saying, like, you can't expect progress to happen like so quick, and saying that he couldn't share details. So based on that, it seemed like Financial Times asked him to comment on their report. And in that comment, he didn't deny it. But and this would be a major concession for Putin, who, his whole thing, Russia's one of their main demands, territorially speaking, is that Ukraine would have to withdraw from these areas that it still controls in these oblasts, and Russia would take over. So there's also other reports saying that, the U.S. is saying that they would recognize Crimea, that they're floating the idea of a potential, European peacekeeping force, which I don't really see Russia going for that. So who knows, what the real chances are here. But European and Ukrainian officials are meeting on Wednesday to discuss this. The U.S. proposal, there's a chance Ukraine might just reject it. Although, judging by what I'm seeing, I think there is a chance that if Ukraine rejects this, then the Trump administration might again, cut the military aid. I think there's a chance of that happening, and then that would essentially force them to make a deal. But Zelensky on Tuesday, what he said amid these reports that saying that the U.S. would recognize Crimea, he said that would never happen, that Ukraine would never do that. So that suggests he's going to reject the U.S. proposals. And one thing, I have to mention in this article. So both Putin and Zelensky also said this week that they're open to the idea of direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which that does seem kind of significant. Then the last time that happened was back in the early days of the invasion in March and April 2022, and the U.S. actually discouraged those negotiations. And as far as we know, and this is from the Ukrainian side, that during those negotiations, Russia's main demand was neutrality, Ukrainian neutrality, and then they would have withdrawn back to the pre-invasion, pre-February 2022 invasion lines. So Russia was not demanding territory. Well, the U.S. discouraged those talks, encouraged Ukraine to fight, funded the war, and then later in 2022, Russia declared that it was annexing this territory. And then since then, the demand has been that any peace deal must involve them getting this territory. So I always go back to those early days. If the U.S. just told Ukraine, sign the deal, we're not going to support this war, all these people would still be alive, and Ukraine would have more territory than it's going to end up with. I mean, realistically, they're not getting this territory back that Russia controls now. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Scott Horton. NATO membership for Ukraine was always Russia's red line. So that is an excerpt from his great book, Provoked. And he's starting to release more of the audio version in podcast form. I believe he's released 3 episodes of that so far. So if you don't want to read this giant book, you could listen to it, start listening to it. One from James Carden, New Europe, Same Old Problems. One from Sama Salaim, Where's Outrage Over Systematic Sexual Violence Against Palestinians? One from Nick Cleveland Stout and Julia Gledhill, Software is Eating the DoD, brought to you by the Atlantic Council. And our spotlight from Ted Galen Carpenter on Russia-Ukraine, 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley Distorts Reality. So please go check all that out. You could always support this show by liking, subscribing, commenting. All that stuff helps out. Follow us on social media, Instagram, on X, on TikTok. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.